Charlie Hardy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a privilege, and it's a good service you're providing for the people of Wyoming. Thanks for the opportunity.
Since you're the most serious Democratic candidate in this race, we'd like to approach this from the perspective of the general election to start out with here. Tell us about a vote Mike Enzi made in which you disagreed, and tell us why you vote differently.
One example would be the Violence Against Women Act. There's a case where half of the Republican senators voted for it. He voted against it. I have a hard time believing why anyone in Wyoming would vote against that. I believe the exception he made was something because it would give judges on the reservation, Wind River Reservation, some power to judge white men who had violated women on the reservation. Maybe I'm mistaken about that, but that's my understanding. That was the reason why he voted against it. I just think it was an important law, and I don't understand why he voted against it. That would be one example. You're asking for one example. Okay. You want another example?
Let's take another.
Okay. Yeah. How about equal pay for equal work? Again, that's an example of something which affects women. What about raising the minimum wage? It's mostly women who suffer because of the minimum wage. I focused in on one area of women, but I just don't think those particular votes were fair, and I don't think they represent what is right for Wyoming.
It's no secret that Washington politics are very polarized. How would you succeed in that environment and ensure that your legislation is passed?
Going all the way back to high school, one of the most important classes I ever had was debating. We had to study both sides of any issue, and we had to be prepared to defend either side of the question. You always end up with a favorite one, but you had to see two sides to every question. And I would say that's characterized my life. This polarization where there's only my way or the highway, I don't agree with that. And all through my life, that's the way I've lived, and I have always had the capability of working with other people.
If elected, you'll be from Wyoming and the lowest ranking member in the chamber. Why should we sacrifice the clout and seniority we have with Enzi to vote for you?
Sometimes I laugh about that. Senator Enzi has said, for example, that if the Republicans are able to take control of the Senate, then President Obama will have to listen to us. You know, for 27 years, Wyoming had a Democratic senator and a Republican senator. That gave us power because we had an entry to the White House, no matter who was in. And the same would be true. Wyoming would be more powerful if we had a Democrat and a Republican in right now. 2 years from now, we don't know who the president will be. Maybe it will be a man, maybe it'll be a woman, maybe it'll be a Democrat, maybe it'll be a Republican. But whether Democrat or Republican, if we have a Democratic senator, Republican senator there, we will have more clout. The other thing is, Senator Enzi, for example, has mentioned the Budget Committee. For 5 years, we've not been able to come up with a budget. Well, he's on that committee, and so he's the longest lasting member of that committee. I mean, after 18 years, I just think there's a lot of ineffectiveness in Washington on the part of Senator Enzi. And nice guy, but why? Why? He's on the Budget Committee, then why can't they come to some agreement on that? So when you look, freshman senator, we have freshman senators in now who have, for better or for worse, have had a lot of clout in the Senate. Ted Cruz, for example, is a freshman senator. So I think it's more a question of ideas than it is how long someone has been there. When I talk to people many times, who are you running against? Mike Enzi. Who? sometimes I'm almost inclined to say I'm running against Senator Who. After 18 years, that I don't want him to be, he shouldn't be famous, an everyday household word, but at the same time, I don't think he's been as effective as many of our Wyoming senators have been throughout the years.
We've seen members of Congress happily take the federal debt obligations to the brink of default. Would you back such a move in the future, and if so, under what conditions?
Senator Enzi has proposed a 1 cent plan, a penny plan, that we could solve the problem of the national debt by taking 1 cent off of all the discretionary funding and so on. I would call that legislative laziness. I'd like to propose a 2 cent plan, using 2 cents of common sense, I guess. No one in their family would cut everything straight across the board. There are some programs which are more important than others. Some need more spending, some need less spending. And any budget planning has to look at what are the greatest needs in our country, where are places where we can cut back. And even in the Simpson-Bowles report, they say that kind of stuff of just going across the board, it makes no sense. So the debt has to be addressed, and yet at the same time, we're not in as bad a shape as people like to as is presented. I mean, that we are just on the brink of defaulting. I'm not an economist. What I've seen is that the proportion of our debt in relation to the gross national product is smaller now than it was when President Obama came into power. But I'm not an economist. I just don't think it is as serious a problem as Senator Enzi would like us to think it is. He says he can't go to sleep at night worrying about the national debt. I wish he wouldn't be able to go to sleep because there's kids in Wyoming who are hungry tonight, because there's people working all week long and they're not making enough to get through next week, because there's sick people who aren't getting medical attention. I see those things as much more important than saying I'm worried about the national debt.
Let's talk about energy exports of coal and natural gas. What would you do to help Wyoming's products make it to foreign customers?
What would I do to help getting Wyoming's products to foreign countries? I would like to put it in this context. We have, for example, the best coal in the whole world. I would hope that that would be the coal that would be used throughout the world. I am concerned, though, that a city like Gillette, Wyoming, could become a ghost town overnight. And it's related to this. The coal companies will survive. We in Wyoming, 4 people in Wyoming can produce as much coal as 43 people in Kentucky. But if the coal companies discover that 100 workers or 200 workers in China or somewhere else around the world can produce that amount of coal, and they can make more money off of that, then that's where they will go. I'm concerned about workers in Wyoming. We have to diversify our sources of income. Outsourcing, to me, is a big problem, and it's related to this. We have to ensure that the people in Gillette, if the coal companies should pull out, and someday they will pull out, all right, that they're not going to lose the value of their homes, they're not going to lose their jobs, and so we've got to look about diversifying our sources of income within the state of Wyoming. One of the things that I think is important is this whole thing of the outsourcing. I find myself, I grew up with Levi's. I went to buy a pair of Levi's. $50. They're the kind 1 inch too big in the waist, 2 inches too long. You wash them, they shrink. That's the way I grew up in Cheyenne from the time I was a little kid. $50. Recommended price $64. On the back it says San Francisco, California. And you look inside and it says made in Egypt. Those could be made here in the United States. They could be made in Wyoming. And people could be paid $25, $30 an hour, and they could still be sold at $50 for a pair of Levi's. You call someone to order something, an 800 number I called, and the person said, "What's your zip code?" 82001. And the person said, "Shane?" I said, "Yeah, Shane, Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming." And I said, "Where are you?" "The Philippines." A young man, a young woman here in Wyoming. He wasn't doing telemarketing. He was a salesperson. That could be done here. Things like that. I'm just saying we need to stop outsourcing. We need to bring companies back to the United States and back to Wyoming. Just as an example. I think it's important to see the whole energy question in this context of work and jobs. I'm concerned too in, for example, Gillette, Wyoming. I was in Gillette, Wyoming, was it just last week, I believe? Some people are earning good salaries. Motels, $190 a night. Almost, there's very few places in Wyoming, maybe Jackson, Cody, where things are that expensive, and I'm not sure they're that expensive there. And yet I went into a fast food place. They were looking for workers. I asked this young lady, "How much do you make?" $8 an hour. When you look back historically in our country, the people fought for the 40-hour work week so that one could support a family and have time with a small family. No luxuries, but you get a roof over your head, you could get food to eat. That's not possible today. That has got to change. Bringing that in back to, you mentioned some legislation I would disagree with. Senator Enzi makes $174,000 a year, and yet he wasn't in favor of raising the minimum wage for people who earn a lot less. If he were to make the minimum wage for every hour that he spends in the legislative chambers, I can't give you the exact figure, but I think he'd probably make $7,000 a year. And would he be able to survive on that? So I put the whole energy question, and we have the best coal in the world, we have great resources, but all of that could collapse along the way. We've got to look, too, in the way of energy, for alternative energy sources. And you see the power companies around the state, they're doing that, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, and so on. We've got to keep those things in mind.
What role should the EPA play, and do you think it's fulfilling that role?
With regard to the Environmental Protection Agency, I think it's important to go back to its foundation, too. It was President Richard Nixon in 1970 who, if I'm not mistaken, was a Republican who brought it into existence because it is an important agency. We need the Environmental Protection Agency. When they overstep their bounds, then they should be called back in and reined in. But to just, some people are saying, get rid of the EPA and so on. No, that makes no sense whatsoever. But like any government agency, they can end up butting in your lives, and bureaucrats are dangerous sometimes, okay? They're supposed to help, but sometimes they don't. And which brings in the whole question of government interfering in people's lives. You have the whole thing. I'm very upset about the idea that someone looks at every email I send, or could look at every email I send, might listen to every phone call that I make. I was on a plane one day, and the man next to me said, "Well, if you don't have anything to hide, there's no problem." And I said, "But how would you feel if your next-door neighbor were listening to everything that you were saying?" He said, "I'd tell him to stop it." And I said, "Well, maybe if he works for Booz, Allen, and Hamilton, your next-door neighbor could be listening to everything." So it's things, the EPA is just part of a bigger problem of government interfering in our lives, in our private lives.
Any specific examples for EPA overreach?
Sorry. I can't give you any.
You touched on a lot of differences between yourself and Mike Kinsey, but we'll wrap up with this. Why should I vote for you instead of Mike Kinsey?
Because I've spent my whole life listening to people and accompanying people in their struggles. When I was 20 years of age, I began traveling the back roads of Colorado and Wyoming, meeting with migrant farm workers, small farmers. Today in Washington, it seems the people who are most listened to are those who have the most money, lobbyists, corporations, Wall Street. That I see is the biggest political problem today in the United States. When we talk about this election, how many $1 million does it take to win an election? I'd like to challenge Senator Enzi to take all the money that he's received from corporations, from lobbyists, from Wall Street, bankers, and so on, give it to the Veterans Administration, let them use it however they want to. And let's go through this campaign based on what contributions we've received from individuals. And I think I don't need any handicap in that regard. But money has come to play. Money is more important than people in politics. It's great that Mike Enzi comes back here every weekend, he says. That's fine. But who is he listening to? When you look at the money that's involved, it'd be nice at his ice cream parties if he'd pass a hat around and use that for his campaign instead of the hat that's been passed around in Washington.
Charlie Hardy, thank you for joining us today.
And thank you. And again, this is so important to provide people with a chance to see every candidate. I really appreciate it. I want to say thanks.